Hi, my name is Sam Woods. I work for Tropical Birding Tours, and today I'm going to take you through the Sri Lanka tour. Sri Lanka Ceylon Sojourn. Ceylon is the old name for Sri Lanka. We have a wild elephant on the title slide here. They're very common in Sri Lanka and a big part of their culture. And then on the left, above the national flag, we have their national bird, the Sri Lanka jungle fowl, a wild native bird related to the chicken. And above that, we have some of the local Sinhalese writing, which I just happen to think is pretty cool. So Sri Lanka is an island off of southern India. It's a country of its own, has some similarities because it is within the Indian subcontinent, but it also has some extreme differences from India itself. India is majority Hindu, whereas Sri Lanka is majority Buddhist, giving it a very different feel to a lot of the parts of India. Above the national flag on the right, we have the international flag for Buddhism, which is the top flag there. I guess the most famous export from Sri Lanka is Ceylon tea. Ceylon is the old name for Sri Lanka. If it's good enough for the royal family, it's good enough for me. I'm a fanatic tea drinker, so this tour goes down well with me straight off the bat. We get to sample really great tea on this trip on a regular basis every day. And we also go to a tea factory to sample different types, see how it's made, and then you can actually sample some of the finer teas out there and buy them directly from the source. Also famous for its spices, which is more like India, I guess. They have some mild curries there, quite different from some Indian curries. A lot of coconut in there, a lot of cinnamon. But yeah, for me and some of the other guides who've done this trip, no doubt the food is a big highlight. As I said, it's a majority Buddhist country, and one of the things we do on this trip in Kandy, which is the cultural capital of the country, we spend a night there and we visit a temple there called Temple of the Tooth, which is said to shelter a fragment of the tooth of the Buddha. So that's one of our cultural highlights of the tour near the end on one of the final nights. And here we go, here's a picture of all the main sites of the tour. They're all in the south. The tour is a 14-day tour. It starts and ends in the modern capital, Colombo, and it visits all three of these zones. You've got the wet zone in the southwest of the country, which has wet rainforests. That's where the majority of the endemic birds are found. Then you have the majority island, which is dry zone, so much more open wooded areas, not as wet as the name implies. And that's where the game parks are. So we get our excellent mammal watching there. Probably the best photography of the trip is there. And we also got some specialties there too. And then we finish up the tour in sort of the hill country because some of the specialty endemics and southern India specialties you need to look for in the hills. So that's sort of where we wrap the tour up in the hills before returning to Colombo. The endemic birds, here's a selection of here. That's a big feature of the tour, obviously. There are currently 34 recognised endemic birds, and that list is generally growing as year by year they decide to split local forms off. And one thing to say is that Sri Lanka is fairly easy birding, so on this trip you have a very good chance of seeing all 34 endemics. I think so far we've always managed to get them. The endemics are well celebrated in the country alone, as you can see from this slide. It adorns their banknotes. So yes, you might find it difficult to actually spend the money because you want to keep it as a souvenir. Here are two of some of the more recently minted endemics, crimson-backed and red-backed flamebacks. They've recently been split. There's a few others in the offing, I'm sure. So we've got 34 endemics at the moment. Good chance of all of those, and there may be more by the time you decide to join this tour. It's a good tour for owls. One of the neat things about India and Sri Lanka too is that a lot of the local guides have staked out the owls in the daytime, meaning we don't have to sweat it out at night looking for them, which is just fine by me. We've got an endemic one on the left, the chestnut-backed owlet, and then a much more widespread one on the right, the brown wood owl. Now, the avifauna, the bird life of Sri Lanka is very well known, but then a curious thing happened a while ago when this sound was heard at night. 6 years after that sound was heard by the Sri Lankan birder, ornithologist, this bird on the right was found for the first time in 2001, the Serendip scops owl. Serendip means Sri Lanka. So they found it, so he heard it. Took him 6 years to actually locate one and see one. And then in 2001 he saw one, and then in 2004 that news was broadcast to the world, and it became the first new described bird in Sri Lanka for 130 years, the first discovered bird there. So pretty awesome that. And we get it on most trips because they've now got regular places where they find it roosting. And it's a tiny owl, only a little bit bigger than North America's elf owl. It's really small ginger owl. It's the Serendip scops owl. So that's one of our major targets. And only described in 2004. And I should mention that even though I've been mentioning the endemic birds, this is an excellent trip for natural history people too. So we have a good chance of seeing all the endemic birds, the 34 of them, but we also have excellent chance to see other mammals, monkeys like this Tokay macaque, butterflies and lizards too. So it's a really good all-round natural history trip. You can get the birds without compromising your chance to see other animals too. So I highly recommend it for people who like all kinds of natural history. This is one of the rarer ones, the sloth bear. One of the things we do on this trip, I should say, is in the southeast, in the dry zone, we go into sort of 3 different main game parks, and that's where we see a lot of other mammals as well as birds too. And it also is a good place to get really good photographs because it's quite open. So this is a neat trip. 1, to get endemic birds. 2, to get other animals, and 3, for the casual photographer who likes to take photographs on the fly, because a lot of opportunities present themselves. And here's a couple of more interesting endemic lizards to the area, particularly like the rhinoceros lizard, which you have a good chance of in the hills near the end of the tour. So the tour starts off in the wet zone. We travel from Colombo on the west coast and travel inland about 2.5 hours drive to Kitulgala, which is an area we spend 2 nights in the wet zone. This area was famous. This is actually the view from the back of our hotel. This area was famous because it was the location where the bridge on the River Kwai, the Hollywood movie, was filmed. Not this particular spot, but nearby. And it's a good place because you can visit an area of gardens with trees that get a lot of the endemic birds that like the more open habitat. It also has dense rainforests of some of the more closed forest endemics. And it just has very nice, easy open birding for the beginning of the trip. And we typically get dozens of endemics pretty quickly at this place. This is not an endemic, but it's one of the most common species we'll see regularly throughout the trip. One of the first endemics could be the Sri Lanka grey hornbill. Spot-winged thrush is another endemic species. Beautiful song. Forages on the ground, but can be quite hard to see when it's singing up in the trees. This is not endemic, but it's a real nice, handsome flycatcher we often get around our hotel. The Tickles blue flycatcher. If you've not been to Asia before, one of the interesting things is it has a series of blue flycatchers with orange on the breast. I've no idea why, but it's a very pleasant Asian characteristic. Another specialty bird, the Lotan sunbird. This is a female feeding in the village of Kitulgala. And Asia in general, and Sri Lanka is no different, has a series of birds that are called babblers. Very hard to say what they are because it's a loose term. And Sri Lanka has a number of endemic ones like this one, the brown-capped babbler. And this is not endemic, the dark-fronted babbler. And then finally we have another endemic one called the orange-billed babbler. Very well named. There's another babbler that occurs with it called the yellow-billed babbler. I'm not kidding. And as I say, this trip's good for endemics, but also it's good for birds that you may want to see that you haven't seen that occur in other parts of India, like the Indian pitta. This 14-day trip, is always timed for the boreal winter, usually around January, February time, and that's when birds like the Indian pitta winter there in great numbers. So they're easy to find because it's a major wintering ground. And around the village we can see this endemic bulbul. A bulbul is a type of medium-sized Asian bird, and this is another one that's only found on Sri Lanka, the black-capped bulbul. So that wraps up our first wet zone site, but then we stay in the southwest but head south this time, drive about 3 hours to a place called Sinharaja, and we stay in a lodge called Blue Magpie Lodge, which is a hint of things to come. Around the lodge itself, you have some gardens and some sort of patches of trees, which are good for edge habitat endemics. So just walking from the lodge can be really good. One of the birds that likes those areas where there's thickets is the green-billed cuckoo, which is a kind of endemic cuckoo. And it's also good to see things like parrots. There's several endemic parrots. This is one of them, the adorable Sri Lanka hanging parrot, smaller than most of the American sparrows. Tiny little bird, but beautifully coloured, often flying over, calling, telling you it's there, and frustrating a lot of perching. But one thing that's cool about the area around Blue Magpie Lodge is you can walk around the gardens and you get up into a sort of a small hill where you can actually see a lot of the trees at eye level and see birds like this that are feeding in the canopy at eye level, which is very cool. And this goes for these two species too, the endemic Layard's parakeet and the endemic yellow-fronted barbet. So there's also sort of other species of barbet and parakeets that are common on the island. Rose-ringed parakeet's quite common on the island, but it's not a specialty. But it'll be a regular sound and sight on the island as we go, particularly into the dry zone. Around the lodge, you get birds gather too. So you see things like white-browed fantail around the lodge. And sometimes flying around the open areas, we get this crested tree swift. If you've never been into Asia, you may not be familiar with the family. They're similar to swifts, but in a different family. They perch much more often. This is the crested tree swift, well named. Beautiful photograph here. Actually is a bird sitting on the nest. That inconspicuous, minimal looking clump of moss or whatever it is under its belly is actually a nest. And this is one of the most spectacular birds on Sri Lanka. One of the things we do in Sinharaja, we have these edge places, these gardens we can go birding, but then we take jeeps up a rough road into some dense rainforest. And in that rainforest, we look for a load of endemics, some of which we could have seen in Kitulgala, but this is the best dense rainforest on the island. And it's very easy to walk in. There's a nice flat track. We just spend the day there walking to and from that track. And we look for mixed flocks with birds like this in the red-faced malkoa, which is a kind of big endemic cuckoo. And we also look for this, and let me just play the call now. This is their national bird, Sri Lanka junglefowl. Not a particularly melodious bird, but it is their national bird. Even though it looks like a chicken, they don't actually like open habitats, so you most often see them in forests, and they're actually quite shy. You hear them a lot and don't see them, but there is a few places like Sinharaja where birding tourists go regularly, and they often come out for us. And this is arguably one of the most wanted birds on the entire island, the Sri Lanka blue magpie. Large, spectacular magpie, sometimes on their own in little groups. Sometimes they'll be around with mixed flocks. So we're always looking for mixed flocks because it can hold a series of endemic birds like this one, white-faced starling, Sri Lanka scimitar babbler, ashy-headed laughing thrush, and things like orange-billed babbler. So it's, the mixed flocks can bring us a swift run of endemics straight off the bat. And now I'm going to show you the hardest of all the endemics. This is the one we'll probably spend the most time looking for, the Sri Lanka thrush. This is a ground-feeding shy thrush that rarely seems to sing, so we have to just clap eyes on it in regular places they hang out. They tend to like dark little gullies by streams. So yeah, we spend a bit of time walking the easy forest trails to kind of walk around and bump into this one at some point. And so far we've always managed to do it. So yeah, we have to be patient with this one, but we usually get it. This is another of the tougher endemics. It's a forest bird called a Sri Lanka spurfowl. It's in the same family as pheasants. It's called a spurfowl. Unfortunately, you can't see it here, but they have this dangerous-looking spur that sticks out from their legs. This is a male. They're also a forest bird, very loud but hard to see. But in recent years, there's been a garden on the edge of the forest where quite often they come out to feed and they throw out rice for them, and they come out with the jungle fowls actually, and that's the best place to see them. So Sinharaja is our best chance at seeing that one. And we also spend some time looking for this, the Sri Lanka frogmouth. If you've never come across frogmouths, they're a species of night bird, a nocturnal species, and they have these broad open mouths, which is why they call them frogmouths. They feed on insects by catching them at night. But it's actually quite regular to see them in the day at Sinharaja, which is our very best place to see them, because the local rangers are often good at sort of pinpointing where they are. And so that brings to a close our time in the wet zone of Sri Lanka in the southwest area. We now take a break and go straight towards the coast, a few hours drive, maybe 3 hours drive, to go to the south coast, or something quite different indeed. I mentioned before this is a good trip for natural history, and this is a good example of that right here. Where we get to the south coast, we go on a boat trip to look for blue whale. This is one of the best places in the world to see them, and so it's a nice diversion from the endemic birds. A lot of people worry that you might compromise your endemic bird chasing by going after the mammals, but Sri Lanka is one of those cool places where you can get the endemic birds and get the mammals too, get great photographs. It's all there in one great package. After we've done the blue whale diversion, we then move into the southeast of the island, into the dry zone. So we've done some time in the wet zone, now we're in the dry zone and we're heading for the game parks down in the southeast, indicated on the map there. So this is very, very different birding and very easy birding. We usually stay in a hotel near Udawalawe National Park and often Indian Scops House in the garden. If we don't find it in the daytime, the normal, then we go out at night. And then when we go into the game parks, one of the most familiar sounds might be familiar to you if you've never been to the Indian subcontinent, but it is one of the most, I think it's a fantastic sound, but I prefer hearing it in India rather than somewhere like Texas where they're not meant to be. So over to the bird. It's a bit of a racket, but it's really cool to hear in the places they're meant to be. And in these game parks of the southeast, we have great chances to both see and photograph them. It is one of the world's classic birds. Udawalawe is also a good park for Asian elephant. We have a good chance of seeing it there. I should say that we go into these game parks, these 3 different parks, in jeeps, which are open-sided, so we will get a good chance to photograph and see things up close. Very good viewing from the vehicles. They're kind of like African game viewing vehicles. Wild buffaloes, these are not domestic cows. They're easy to find in these game parks. I just like this crow is picking stuff out of a domestic cow's ear. Don't ask me why, I liked it. And here's a chital deer with a white-browed fantail using its backside as a perch. We had that bird earlier on this presentation. Chital deer, we don't get tigers in Sri Lanka. You do get some other big cats, and we'll get to them shortly. But chital deer is actually the main prey item of tigers in mainland India. And these game parks are really good for water birds. So they're kind of scrubby, open with short wooded areas, not like the rainforest at all. And you have loads of wetland areas. So we'll see lots of wetland birds as we go around, like these storks, and also woodland birds too. So it's a good combo of different things, both to see and photograph. Here's a painted stork. And continuing the stork theme, we have a lesser adjutant, an endangered species. So as we drive around, we pass by ponds with things like grey-headed swamp hen in them, and then we also look for passerines and songbirds in the wooded areas we pass through too. It's kind of a nice, interesting mix of birds. Sri Lanka is better for shorebirds than you probably realise. Most people think of it as thick forest, and that's true in the southwest wet zone. But in these areas of the dry zone, we've got a lot of shorebirds, a lot of water birds too. Thanks to my colleague Ken for getting this amazing picture of a purple sunbird. We'll have seen some sunbirds already, but this particular one likes the dry zone most, so it's best look for there, along with things like green beater. Green beater is like a photographer's dream. Their habit is to perch in the open in nice light at eye level. We couldn't ask for more. Here's one of the rarer birds in the dry zone, the Marshall's or white-tailed Iora. Iora is a family of an Asian bird family, which you may not be familiar with. They're yellow and green with bold wing markings usually. And we have a chance of 2 on the trip. The common Iora we should see multiple times. This one's a bit more tricky and has only recently been found to be regular in areas. They didn't realise how regular it was in some areas of Sri Lanka until fairly recently. And raptors, we often see things like Brahminy kite, crested serpent eagle, and this changeable hawk eagle as we do these game drives. Another bee-eater to occupy us is the chestnut-headed bee-eater, bigger than the other one, but no less beautiful. And we'll have looked for some endemic barbets in the wet zone of the southwest, but the dry zone has a widespread species called the coppersmith barbet, probably the most handsome of them all actually, but not endemic, much more widespread. And I've said before that there's Sri Lankan endemics, there's a bunch of widespread Indian birds, which will be lifers for people who've not been to India before, and then there's some specialties of southern India that overlap in Sri Lanka too, and this is one of those, so Malabar pied hornbill. If you've only been to northern India before, it's very likely you wouldn't have seen this one. And one of the places we base ourselves at the game parks is a place called Tisa in short. It's the most common name used for it. It has a very long, complicated name that I'm not going to try here. I don't want to look like a fool. Tisa will do just fine for me. And they have these big wet areas called tanks around the town. And these are actually artificial wetlands that are amazing for birds. So a lot of people a lot of people think about these habitats as they look quite natural, but they're actually artificial habitats that have taken up and provided beautiful bird habitat for things like spot-billed pelicans. It's not uncommon for me to see this from the hotel lunch table over someone's shoulder it drifts by. And this is probably my favourite bird in the tanks there, is the pheasant-tailed jacana. And they're at their best at this time of year, even though it's the winter for us when we visit, the boreal winter. The birds are actually in breeding plumage when we visit, when they look like this. They have their long tails, they have all the fancy plumage all going on at the right time for us. And in little groves and plantations around the edge of the tanks, we look for this one of the more scarce birds, which is the white-naped woodpecker. There's not a long list of woodpeckers on the island, but the ones that are there are pretty damn spectacular. Flamebacks and this guy. And I wanted to show you leaf birds because this is another bird that you can often get around the edge of the tanks in this open woodland. And leaf birds are another family like the Ioras, which are an Asian bird family you may not be familiar with. All of them are bright green in colour, and this Jerdon's leaf bird is a specialty of southern India and Sri Lanka. So often a life bird for people who've never been to that part of the world. And then on the edge of this tank we also have these open woodlands which have large roosts of bats. These are Indian flying foxes. They are as big as some foxes, believe it or not. They're huge bats that there's huge roosts of them of hundreds, and they're actually nocturnal, and they go out great distances at night to look for fruits. They're a fruit-eating bat. And then the main game park we go into in the southeast is called Yulla. This is the most famous park in the country and the most popular park in the country, and I'll show you why in a minute. This is called Elephant Rock, because it's said to resemble an elephant, and there are elephants in the park. This is a few of these parks in the southeast. They're excellent for doing these jeep drives to get photographs of mammals. So a lot of the trips we do in there are good for photographs of mammals, of birds and mammals too, and reptiles. So this is the main mammal that creates the popularity of the park. The park has the highest density of leopards on Earth, so that's a good reason to go there for me. So we spend a full day in the park and have a good chance of finding this. Usually we wait till the late afternoon because that's the best time when they're often most active. Other mammals we could come across in the park include things like mongoose. We've got wild boar wallowing there, and the tufted grey langur. We also have tokay macaque in the park, and chital deer and samba deer. So there's a whole bunch of animals we can see in the park aside from birds. But we're seeing birds as we go around all day long, like this Indian roller. And last but not least, the dry zone doesn't have the number or the abundance of endemics that the wet zone has, but this is the endemic that you really need to go into the dry zone for, the Sri Lanka wood shrike. Probably a new family for many, the wood shrikes and vangas. And it's quite easy to find in this sort of dry open habitat, sometimes on game drives in the park and sometimes outside. So that's our kind of main endemic target in the area. But as you can have seen over the last few slides, we're looking for mammals too. We're looking for photogenic birds like bee eaters and rollers. It's just a very enjoyable time in the southeast and very different from what we'll have done at the beginning of the trip. So then we move on to the hills for the final part of our journey. So just to recap what we've done. We started in the modern capital of Colombo on the west coast. We went inland east and did several sites in the wet zone, the wet rainforest of the southwest. We diverted to the south coast to look for blue whales on a boat trip. Then we spent time in the southeast in the dry zone, in much more open dry habitat to look for specialties of that area, and particularly to get loads of photographs and close-ups of wildlife. And then we go north again from the southeast inland, and we steadily make our way north to a town called Nuwara, which is in the hills, the foothills in Sri Lanka. So this is nice and cool, a nice pleasant climate to stay at. This is tea growing country. We usually visit a tea factory during this time where you can both sample different varieties of tea and buy them directly from the source. This can include tea made for the royal family, so it's not all bottled in a pile here. We'll have a whole range of different style teas to try from. So from Nuwara we do two main sites, Horton Plains for the day, and then we also visit a local park called Victoria Park. The plains are the highest point of the tour and the most scenic point of the tour. Absolutely stunning day this, so we hope for good weather. When I say it's high, it's only about 2,200 meters, more or less 7,200 feet, so it's not altitude problems of any sort, but it's beautiful. It's wet forest, stunted forest, and you get specialty birds like this yellow-eared bulbul, one of the endemics. And this elevation is also best for Sri Lanka white-eye, another species confined to Sri Lanka. And this is kind of the habitat you're birding in. So it's, as you can see from the size of the group, it's kind of short, stunted, but dense forest. And it's a good place for a load of endemics that we wouldn't have a chance of outside of the hills, like Sri Lanka bush warbler. Sri Lanka whistling thrush is another one. I'll get to that in a minute. This is not an endemic, but a nice bird, and it's a good place for it. The velvet-fronted nuthatch, just a beautiful bird. This is the Sri Lanka whistling thrush. I have to say I grit my teeth when I see this photograph by my colleague Ken and friend Ken. I don't feel so friendly with him when I see the photograph, because although we get this bird on every tour, we don't usually get it and photograph it like this because the light is quite challenging. In the southeast game parks we've had great light, but in the hill forest here this bird can often be in really dark shadow. This endemic bird, which is a hill specialist, the dull blue flycatcher, I feel kind of offended by the name because to me this is very far from dull blue. And we may have well seen it by this point, but mammals are not missing from the high elevations either. Sometimes you get sambar deer, sometimes you get this purple-faced langur, which is a specialty endemic to Sri Lanka. And we can also get lizards too. Lizards are good on this trip, I'll tell you. This is a black-lipped lizard, often hanging out on the walk to what we call the World's End, which is the most scenic part of the trip. We usually do this walk not because we're particularly looking for any birds, but we just want to see views like this. The World's End in Horton Plains National Park. And so the other place we bird in the hills, it's kind of wrapping up this part of the trip now, is Victoria Park, which is a manicured, beautiful little park just in the middle of a town near a hotel where we look for some birds that winter there. So remember, this trip's done usually around January, March, and that's when some birds winter in Sri Lanka that are hard to see on their breeding grounds because they're in much more remote or difficult areas to get to. Some of them are high altitude. So the park's good for forest wagtail. This is an odd wagtail that instead of bouncing its tail up and down, it does it from side to side. And particularly a rarer one is the pied thrush in the bottom right corner. The whole population basically winters on Sri Lanka, and then in the summer they go and breed high in the Himalayas, so it's actually quite a hard bird to access on its breeding grounds. So quite often people go and see this in Sri Lanka. It's one of the birds they get as a lifer in Sri Lanka, even if they've birded the Indian subcontinent before, because it's just not a very easy bird to find outside of its winter grounds. And the same goes to this beautiful Kashmir flycatcher, another bird that breeds in the Himalayas, that breeds up high in the Himalayas, and it's much easier to find here, lower down when it's wintering, much easier to find in a small town park. And so I'm getting to the end of the tour here, so I just want to surmise really that one of the things that's good for is endemic birds. There's 34 of them currently, could be more soon, and typically we see all of those endemic birds on this 14-day trip. Also good for seeing other birds that are in India that are maybe southern Indian specialties, that if you've not been to that part of India, will add yet more lifers. And to do this, we visit a wet zone rainforest, we visit the dry zone, which is very open, where we can get to do game drives for other wildlife too. This is a great trip for natural history in general, for lizards, mammals, butterflies. And then we finish off in the hills to get some hill specialties at the end that I just described. Now, the other thing is, you're in Sri Lanka, in the Indian subcontinent. You may also want to add more time while you're there. So after joined on to this 14-day tour, we typically do a Southern India 9-day tour, which goes after more specialties, as you can see here, which are endemic to Southern India. So if you want to add that on, we have a standalone tour, which you can do as a distinct 9-day tour on its own, or it can be added onto the Sri Lanka trip, usually just before the Sri Lanka trip, to get you yet more endemics and yet more birds and animals. And so, yes, I hope I've given you the idea this is a good natural history tour. You can have all the endemic birds and have the other natural history too, like these flowers. And it's a good trip for endemic birds. It's a good trip for natural history, and it's a good trip for casual photographers with lots of good photography on the trip. I hope I've convinced you. I really like going there. I desperately enjoy the tea as well as everything else, and the curries. And another thing I should mention is it's an incredible place for buying gems. If you're going to get married soon, we can pop into a gem store. This is where Princess Di got her sapphire. So that's another little known fact about Sri Lanka. So I hope you've enjoyed the tour, and I hope you'll get to go there as I have. I'm looking forward to going again very much soon. Thank you very much for supporting these virtual tours.